Now, I'd like to start by telling a story which I heard on the radio very many years ago, and which I think has a very important message for all writers. I will ask you to watch your own emotions, your inner reaction as you listen to the story, because the message will be involved in that. And the story was on a radio program, which was a serial concerning the activities of two teenagers by the name of Cecil and Sally. And in this particular episode, Cecil was boasting that he could invent a riddle. Now, Sally had expressed the opinion that it takes an awful lot of brains. Someone must be very smart to be able to invent a riddle. And Cecil said, oh no, anybody can invent one. So she asked him to do it. And he proceeded to propose the following riddle. It went something like this. A tall, well-dressed man is walking down the street, following a beautiful girl who wears a white scarf. He catches up with her, he seizes the scarf, and runs away. He hides in the doorway 5 blocks away and waits until a nursemaid comes by, wheeling a baby carriage. When she has gone by, he crosses the street, goes into a restaurant, sits down, and orders a sandwich and a cup of coffee. By the time the sandwich is brought to him, however, he has departed. He's now walking rapidly down the street, and he stops at a traffic light where there are cars waiting. He approaches a dilapidated car driven by 2 disreputable characters, and just as the car starts, he throws the white scarves into the driver's lap and runs away. When the clock strikes 2, he enters the best jewelry store in town, approaches the distinguished old clerk, and lowering his voice, he asks for a sandwich and a cup of coffee. Now Cecil concludes the story by asking, why did the man do all these things? And Sally tries to guess, she can't, she gives up, and he answers, because the man was crazy. Now, is there anyone here who, when I gave you the solution to that riddle, didn't feel let down, cheated, and disappointed? Did everybody feel that? Did you listen to the story with a certain amount of attention? At this point, I will really permit answers from the audience. Can someone tell me why the story interested him and why the end was a total washout?
Because I would say that it is very obviously the story of something that would be very crazy. It sounds very crazy. And when it comes to the end, and that is exactly what the answer is, what you've been led to expect, a reasonable explanation for seemingly crazy events, is totally gone.
Well, it's true, except that actually, if those events were connected by any kind of explanation, it wouldn't be a crazy story. It would be a very intriguing one if all of that had a purpose. Pardon?
This is like the illustration you gave before of telling the story and having the man wake up at the end and find out it was a dream.
Somewhat. Except that there it's just the whole thing is a cheat. But it's somewhat the same principle of building up to something you can't explain and then getting out of explaining it. In that sense, it's the same. Did you have something to say about it?
Yes, I was going to say the purpose of a riddle, of course, is an answer to follow certain events that you present logically. And this gave no logical answer, therefore it has
That's right.
no purpose.
Now, here you anticipate exactly what I was going to say, or part of it, but that's fine. All right, now let me proceed from here if we're all in agreement on the main point. The main point being that your interest could be held only so long as you thought that there was some purpose to the events which you were hearing. Now, this is true of a story as well as a riddle. And Tina pointed out quite correctly that the whole point of a riddle is that there must be a logical connection between the events presented. A riddle is based on the conception of a rational universe. namely that there is an explanation for what you're hearing. Now, if this applies to a riddle, that certainly applies much more strongly to a much more serious matter, namely a story. Story that you write will be based on some kind of purpose and has to have logical connections. Any time that you, the author, are not aware of it, any time that you neglect the conscious understanding and communication to your readers of your purpose and of the logical connections between the events you present and the manner in which you present it, you are in fact on what I shall call thereafter the Cecil premise, namely that the man is crazy. Only in that case it would be the author. Now this was just a joke program, and anyone hearing it could see that it's a joke. But it's not such a joke when someone asks a writer, "Why did you write this story?" And he answers, "Because I felt like it." His principle there is exactly the same as Cecil. That a writer felt like it is not a reason for writing anything. However, like every wrong psychological premise, this modern premise of relying on one's feelings for writing has as its base a proper psychological function of the human mind, only misplaced and corrupted. Namely, a writer's feelings have a great deal to do with what he will choose to write and how he'll write it. But feelings are not a primary and are not a cause. They're an effect. A writer's feelings, just like anyone else's, and his literary tastes or preferences are not innate in him. They're not irreducible primaries that come from nowhere. They come from his premises. And his only choice is whether he knows it or not. All writers, to some extent, have to rely on what is colloquially called inspiration. Namely, that you write without full knowledge why you write it this way, and it comes out well. In reading it afterwards, you find that you have said exactly what you wanted. That happens. But you have to know where it comes from, why it happens, and how to make it happen to you. All writers have to rely on their subconscious, but one has to know how to work with one's own subconscious. That is the most difficult and the most interesting part of writing. Now, what you will find today is the exact opposite of this school of literature. Most writers not only cannot account for why they chose to write a particular book or story, but they certainly will refuse to account for the manner in which they wrote it, the reason for every paragraph, or the reason for the structure of a sentence. They will act, perhaps not most, but the majority today, they will act like the kind of artist that Richard Halley denounced in Atlas Shrugged. If you remember his speech to Dagny in chapter 2, part 3, that is perhaps the most autobiographical speech in the whole book. Namely, I was expressing my own feelings against inspirational writers and non-objective artists and the whole school of thought which separates art from the mind. If you ever want to read it, substituting me for Halley and literature for music, you might get a kick out of it because you know a little more about me and about my basic premises in these lectures. The writers today, in effect, take the attitude of the worst medieval mystics. Now you know the mystic formula which you probably all heard, one way or another, for those who need, who don't need an explanation, none is necessary. For those who need an explanation, none is possible. Now that is the mystic racket's slogan of religious mystics and of artistic mystics. The simple meaning of that sentence is, I don't know why I'm doing it, and I don't want to account for it. Now, there can be nothing more viciously contradictory in terms as such a term as non-objective art. Now, we all hear it, it's an accepted term, and yet ask yourself exactly what it means. That is, an objectivity presupposes that there is an outside reality which we all perceive, and that we have the means to perceive it. If we all are one species and we perceive the same reality, then we have means to communicate about it. If the reality which we perceive does not exist, or if we all perceive it by different means, by undefined means, by non-objective means, non-objective means precisely that dependent on the individual subject and not on any standard of outside reality nor on other people, and incommunicable to them. If that were true, then no art would be possible. All art necessarily is communication. And when a man announces that he's a non-objective writer, he is simply saying by his own admission that which he is presenting cannot be communicated to others. The question then is, why is he presenting it? And why is he claiming that it's art? Well, again, it's a matter of a mystic's racket. Or this is a practical, specific application on concept. A non-objective artist, whether it's a painter or a writer, is counting on the existence of an objective art and using it in order to destroy it. The best example, of course, is non-objective painter. If the minimum definition of a painting is that it's a representation of recognizable physical objects, then a non-objective painter puts down blobs of paint and proclaims that this is an expression of his subconscious, adding that his subconscious is something that can be defined in any other terms, and either you understand the meaning of the blobs or you don't. Then he hangs them in a gallery. What then does his work have in common with art or with an art gallery? Only the fact that a piece of material is hung on the wall in a frame. And since A is A, since everything has to be something, he has switched the definition of art from any kind of rational meaning to such a fact as a piece of canvas in a frame, and that therefore anything you put into a frame is a work of art. Now, how does it apply to literature? Well, the non-objectivists in literature so far have not yet been accepted fully, but don't delude yourself about one thing. They're on their way, and they're on their way in the same manner as it started in painting. Namely, the art world did laugh at the first non-objective painters, and today it's practically all that exists, as a result of which art, as any kind of meaningful activity, is destroyed. It's now confined to a self-appointed, in effect, elite of mystics who are playing a game to delude those who have money enough to buy it. But the purpose there is not material. The purpose there is to establish an unearned artistic aristocracy. The same purpose which tourist clubs served in the Fountainhead. It is to make art available to everybody, available in the sense of anyone can practice it, just as anyone can invent a riddle by the Cecil premise, and thereafter form a little caste of specialists who will pronounce subjectively, non-objectively, remember the meaning of that, what is art and what is not, and will go around fooling each other and those who wish to support them. That has already happened in the field of art. Now, in literature, we have very few examples of it. But that principle and that influence has penetrated the whole writing field, and if they are not all yet non-objectivists, the elements of reason, and therefore of real art, are rarer and rarer in present-day writing. And if the trend is not stopped, literature will follow in the way of painting and in the way of all other aspects of our civilization. Now, the most known example of a non-objective writer would be Gertrude Stein. Now, she's still somewhat laughed at, but if you observe, they're usually laughing at her rather respectfully. The attitude today predominantly is, well, because she's strange, you know, she's funny, but it's said somewhat dubiously. The implied tone of voice is respectful in the sense of, well, she's odd, but it's probably deep. Why is it deep? Because I, the speaker, cannot understand it. That is the formula by which all those frauds are put over on you. When a person reaches this attitude, and that is the subjectivism of the audience, if the subjectivism of the performer, of the alleged artist, is the mystic's fraud, then the subjectivism of the audience is an inferiority complex. And it consists of this kind of formula. If I don't understand it, it must be profound. Now they're laughing at Gertrude Stein. There is another writer, which in fact is worse, and which is taught in universities and in classes of literature as something very serious, and that is James Joyce. Now, he has gone the whole hog on the Cecil premise. Not only you cannot tell why he writes his stories or what they're about, but you can't even tell what the sentences are. But if Gertrude Stein uses sounds that seem to be like words, or rather she uses words without any grammatical structure into sentences, without meaning, Joyce goes the whole way to the ultimate of what a subjectivist school of writing would be. Namely, he makes up words, he uses words from allegedly different languages and makes some of his own and calls that writing. Now, if writing is the communication by means of language, and that is what writers like Joyce and Stein have discarded, then what is left as the definition of their art? Writing becomes inarticulate sounds printed on paper by means of certain black marks, and that is all that is left of literature. Now, in the same way as anyone who wants to communicate with people has to rely on the concept of an objective reality and objective language, in the same way as anyone who wants to talk or write about philosophy has to rely on an objective reality and objective language, so does every artist and most particularly every writer. If, to any extent whatever, you are on the premise of non-objectivity, that is, if A is A if existence exists, is not your absolute, you, properly speaking, do not belong not only in literature, but in any human activity, nor on this earth, by your own definition and by your own choice. The only reason that bad, evil premises exist among men is only that no one can be fully consistent about evil. Evil is destruction. Anyone who would attempt to be fully consistent about a bad premise would eliminate himself. He would either be dead or at most insane. Therefore, evil premises exist in people only at the expense of or by the mercy of such good premises as the same person holds. What I presented in Atlas as a social conflict, I indicated in Gold's speech, applies also to every man's psychology. Just as in society the wrong principles consist of destroying the best for the sake of the worst, the same conflict exists in every man's soul, in every man who is on the wrong premises. His bad premises exists only to the extent to which his good premises make them possible, support them, and are destroyed in the process of supporting them. A bad premise, if not eliminated, will grow and destroy the good ones. I mention this for the following purpose. If as a writer you will not go as far as Gertrude Stein or James Joyce, if you will not say I am a subjectivist, but you are not fully and consciously sold on the idea of rationality and objectivity, what you will do on paper, in fact, will be a combination of the rational and the irrational, of the right premises and the destructive ones. So that even if you will not claim that you're going to write a book without any knowledge of its meaning, its purpose, or your reason for writing it, you will write a mixture. Namely, you might select a theme, and you might know consciously what it is that you want to say. But thereafter, you will rely on feeling, inspiration, or unidentified premises. And there, your premises might be right or they may be wrong. That which you don't know consciously is not in your conscious control. And therefore, you might stick to rationality in a loose, general way, enough to write something which has the semblance of a story. But in the details of that story, in your choice of characters or choice of events, and in the way you construct your sentences, in every smaller detail of your writing, you will rely on your automatic instincts or feelings. And if questioned, you will say, I don't know. Well, I know my general theme, but I don't know why this particular sentence is written the way it is. I just felt like it. Which will mean that you will be, in effect, a cross between a writer like me and a writer like Gertrude Stein or the Cecil in this riddle, which I told you. And the flaws in your performance will be in proportion, just exactly as bad as the riddle which I told you. Only you might get away with it, speaking metaphorically, to the extent to which the rational elements predominate in your writing. Now, if you don't want to be reduced to this kind of situation, if you don't want your own talent, by which I mean your own good premises, to act as the supporters of your bad premises and of the lazy or the irrational in your own mind, then the first thing that you have to do is to be very conscious of what are your basic philosophical premises generally, and then what are your literary premises in particular. Now, the purpose of this course is to give you the particulars on what are the proper literary premises, and thereafter your job will be, if you know them consciously, to practice them until they become unconscious. Now this brings me to the point which I mentioned, and that is that a writer's feelings do play a great part in his writing, only he has to know how to use them. I would like here to speak briefly about the relationship of your conscious mind to your unconscious, specifically as it applies to writing. I'm not impinging your territory. Now, I wonder if you realize that what do we mean by your conscious mind is a very limited screen of vision, in effect. I'm using the word as a metaphor. At any one time, you can hold only so much in your mind. That is, if right now you are thinking about what you're hearing and concentrating on my lecture, you are not thinking about the total of your knowledge. Nothing about your past or your values or your family or your past experience. Yet they are stored in your mind somewhere. That which you do not hold in your conscious mind at any one moment in a general way is what we call your subconscious. But observe this, the conscious mind of a baby would not be able to listen to this lecture. Why? Because a baby does not have the subconscious knowledge, the premises, the categories necessary for him to understand what is being discussed. I mention this to make you realize that whenever you listen to anything, or whenever you acquire new knowledge, in fact, whenever you are conscious, that which you're conscious of depends for its full understanding by you on that which is already known to you and which is stored in your subconscious. Now, observe what you have to do if you attempt to write the simple sentence on paper. Supposing you start a story and you have to write an opening sentence which might be nothing more than a description of a sunrise, let's say. In order to select the words of that sentence alone, a tremendous amount of knowledge had to be absorbed by you earlier and had to become so automatic that your conscious mind doesn't have to pause on it. Remember that language is a tool which at one time had to be learned by you. You were not born with that automatic knowledge. If today you attempt to learn a foreign language, you'll be able to retrace the process by which you originally learned to speak English. Perhaps the process will be a little faster and simpler, but nevertheless, in essence, it's the same. You have to form associations between certain objects, words, concepts, and connect them to words. At first, when you first learn that this object is a table, the word table will not come to your mind automatically. A baby will have to repeat it many times and get used to it. Or if you now learn a foreign language, when you look at that object, the word that will leap into your mind will be the English word. And it will take you many repetitions before the foreign word for table will become so automatic that merely looking at the table, the word comes to your mind and you're not conscious of groping for it. The knowledge has become automatic. Now, before you sit down to write, if you do not know the language that you're using, do you see that you're making an impossible handicap for yourself? You have to have your language so automatically learned that you are not conscious of groping for the words and forming them into a sentence. Yet, would you say that that which makes you able to select the words is an innate talent or a mystical feeling or an inspiration? No, it's a skill which you learned and have made automatic. Now, in the description of a sunset that you're working on, you want to convey a certain mood. Let us say that is an ominous description. Or I believe I said sunrise the first time. It doesn't matter. Let's say sunrise, but it's an ominous sunrise. You will select different words, different ways of describing it than you would have if your purpose was to describe a bright, cheerful, happy sunrise. Select different words, different ways of describing it than you would have if your purpose was to describe a bright, cheerful, happy sunrise. Now ask yourself, how much knowledge had to go into your being able to differentiate between the two intentions? What is ominous or what is cheerful? What kind of concepts, words, or metaphors will convey one or the other? All that was at one time conscious knowledge. Yet, if you attempted to sit down and, by conscious effort, to select all the words of your sentences and all the elements, the concepts needed to establish a certain mood, the whole of your lifetime probably wouldn't be enough to compose just that one description. You understand what I mean by that? If you had to select it consciously, if you first had to go through the whole dictionary to decide which word you use, and the same for the next word, then if you thought of the mood that you want to convey, to go consciously through all the possibilities, do you see that that would be an impossible process? What is it then that you're doing when you sit down and you write a good description fitting your purposes within a reasonable amount of time according to your skill? What you do is you call on stored knowledge, which has become so automatic that you do not have to be aware of the process by which you selected. If someone then challenges you and asks you, why did you describe the sunrise in this way? You will be able to answer. You will be able to tell the questioner a conscious reason for every word that you included in that description. But you didn't have to be conscious of it while you were writing it. If your writing premises are organized in a proper way, you will not have to recite all the rules to yourself every time you attempt to write a sentence. But what is you call your inspiration, what you call the feeling in writing, is actually the subconscious summing up of the kind of premises and intentions you've set yourself. All writers follow this process, only the difference is, are they good introspectors or not? A writer like me will be able to tell you the reason, and you can challenge me on this later if you want to, for every single punctuation mark, let alone word in Atlas Shrugged. There are 645,000 words in it by the printer's count. I have a reason for every word and every punctuation mark. Now, I did not have consciously to calculate all that when I was writing. But what I was following is a conscious intention, a conscious purpose in relation to the theme of the novel and every part of it and every word that went to express that theme. I would have had to edit it many times, and again, what would make me decide whether a passage was good or had to be changed? The purpose of the novel. I was conscious of my purpose through the whole job. the general purpose of the novel and the particular purpose of every chapter, every paragraph, and every sentence. Now, I may be right or wrong about any particular sentence in it. The only way for me to decide what is right or wrong, or for anyone who criticizes it, would be by means of the standard. Standard would be the purpose. The purpose of the whole novel, and within the novel, the purpose of each particular sentence. So if you don't want to be at the mercy of inspiration, if you don't want to be that part rational, part Gertrude-Stein kind of writer, this is what you have to train yourself to do. You have to first grasp your basic premises very, very clearly, and by that I mean not just as a floating abstraction, not just as a general rule with a few concretes to illustrate it, but with sufficient number of concretes in your mind so that the premise becomes automatic to you. Every premise which you store in your subconscious in this manner, namely, thoroughly understood, thoroughly integrated to the concretes which it represents, every premise will then become part of your writing capital. When you then sit down to write, you will not need to calculate in a slow, conscious way. Your inspiration will come to the exact extent of the knowledge which you have stored. When you get stuck on a piece of writing, it's either that you do not have sufficient knowledge to handle it, or that your purpose in this particular sequence or paragraph is contradictory and you're not clear on it. You might have two clashing intentions. If not in general purpose, then perhaps in specific detail. But whether it's the overall purpose of a novel or the particular structure of one sentence, the general principle there is the same. You will solve it by means of that which you understand consciously. If you have no trouble, it means that your subconscious and the orders you have given it operates properly and does not clash with your intention. Whenever you're stuck on something in writing, it means that there are contradictory orders which you consciously have given to your subconscious, and that the material therefore does not come. Your inspiration does not come. You're stuck. You don't know what to write, or if you write, it comes out badly. This is what I personally call the squirms. That's an aside, but I might be using these terms, so I'll make it clear now so you understand what I mean by it. The squirms is a state of contradictory intention, in effect. It's a state which all writers know, and which consists of either the inability to write anything, or the fact that your writing suddenly comes out badly, that it does not flow as you want it to, and it doesn't express your intention. The reason of it is always a clashing intention or insufficiently concretized knowledge of the material that you want to cover in this particular paragraph or passage. Yes?
May I ask for a concrete illustration of that?
Of the squirms?
Yes.
You mean from my actual experience or just a general example?
Just general example.
Well, supposing you start to write a love scene, and you decide that you want it to be a very tragic one. Let's suppose you have a clear idea of the first few lines. And you write a few lines of dialogue, and then suddenly you don't know what to say next. You might have in mind only the general end of the scene. Let's say it's a tragic love scene which has to end with the two characters renouncing each other. Now you know that they have to finally come to the party, and you don't know how to bring them there. And that anything you put down is somehow not what you want. You might even clearly say to yourself why it's not right. Maybe the dialogue thereafter seems to be repetitious. or it doesn't seem to be too meaningful. It seems to be waste dialogue. And you try it again, and still whichever comes out is not right. That's the squirms. What is the trouble there? It's a very complex issue, but it might be in any one of the elements with which the scene is involved. It might be that you have not fully defined to yourself what is the attitude of either or both of the characters. It might be that you're not quite clear on the nature of the tragedy, or on the nature of love, or on the relationship of that particular scene to what is to follow. In each scene of a story, there is a tremendously complex amount of material which you have to hold in mind. And again, it's an issue where you cannot hold it all in mind consciously. You can only hold the highlights consciously and rely on your subconscious being in order to supply you with all the missing details, the connections, and the concretes through which your general intention has to be expressed. Now, if there is a contradiction, an undecided intention about any one of those elements, it might stop you. And the difficult thing about it, it's in the nature of the process, that you're stopped without having any clear clue to how to solve the scene. The solution, incidentally, is always to think over every possible aspect and every connection to everything relevant in the rest of the book. And to think until your mind goes to pieces if necessary. And I mean this almost literally, to think until you're blank with exhaustion. And the next day start it again. And you might have to do it for days. And finally one morning you have the solution. And it usually happens that way. That, incidentally, is the kind of incident which gives rise to the idea that writing is an innate talent, or that you write because some inner voice dictates to you. That is the psychological explanation of the so-called inspirationalists. They will tell you either that their hidden talent is in some unknowable way dictates to them, or the more mystical one will tell you that it's a voice from beyond. You have certainly heard artists and even writers maintain that they're the representatives of some superior power that has selected them as the vehicles because they hear this dictation. They in effect say, I sat down to write a scene, I didn't know what I was going to write, and suddenly it came to me. And it feels as if it's a voice dictating, so I'm sure it's the voice of God or of a superior power. Well, in fact, it does feel that way. And this sort of experience is not confined to writers. You all know that with any kind of problem, you might be thinking of a problem for many days, and suddenly, seemingly accidentally, you get the idea. The classical example of it, the one we always use in conversation, is Newton and his apple. The apple fell on Newton's head, and that suddenly gave him the idea of the law of gravitation. Well, as I've read it in a book, I don't take credit for it because it's a very good expression. A writer discussing Newton's apple said, accidents don't happen except to those who deserve them. Meaning that Newton had worked on the problem which led to the law of gravitation for a long time. And that what the apple did to him is that it served as the last link integrating all the material, all the conclusions which he had made up to then. Now the same thing happens with a writer's inspiration or with breaking what I call the squirms. There is a period of time or a moment when your subconscious does not work, when you're stuck, when you can't go on writing. The way to break it is to do enough thinking so as to give your subconscious time to integrate the various elements with which your particular problem is involved. When those elements integrate, The idea for what to do with the scene comes to you. And the words to express it come. Now why? Mystically or inspirationally? No. Only because you have cleared those subconscious files, which are your UNIVAC, in effect, which are your lightning calculators, and are operated by means of your conscious decision. There is nothing in your subconscious which you didn't put there, and there is no way to make it work except by giving it uncontradictory orders. In other words, like this: if you decide that you want to describe a cheerful sunset or sunrise, you have to have stored in your mind clear concepts of what you mean by sunrise, what kinds have you seen, what elements compose it, what kind of mood you want to project, and why, and what kind of words will do it. If you are clear on all those elements, when you sit down to use them, they will come to you easily. If you're clear on some but not others, it'll be a little harder to write. If you're not clear at all, if you have nothing but floating abstractions in your subconscious, by floating abstractions I mean abstractions which are not connected by you to any concretes, then you will sit down and stare at a blank sheet of paper. Nothing will come out of your mind because you have put nothing there. It's in this sense that a writer has to know how to use his subconscious, how to make his conscious use it as a UNIVAC. You know what the UNIVAC is? It's a lightning calculating machine. But someone has to feed the material into that machine and has to set the stops and make the selections if he wants a certain answer. Now you have to know how to make your conscious mind do exactly that to your subconscious UNIVAC. You have to know what you're storing there and then what kind of answers you're asking for. If you store the material properly, it will come to you. If not, you will know how to gather further material in order to make it work. In this manner, you will never be at the mercy of inspiration. Even so, you won't be able to guarantee that you will always write with exactly the same perfection of style so many hours a day. You will never be able to guarantee that you'll work from 9 to 5 at your desk and everything will come out perfectly, unless you're a hack. But I'm now speaking of serious writing. What you will be able to guarantee is that you will always be able to express exactly what you intended to express. And here I want to pause for a moment to speak of those writers who are in the majority, but predominant majority. And I mean good writers who have probably heard or read saying that they never express that which they intended, that every book is a disappointment to the author because it's an approximation. Because no writer can ever express fully what he wanted to express. Now I've heard even Sinclair Lewis, who's a very good writer, state exactly this kind of thing. And there you're hearing a part subjectivist. If a writer feels that he's unable fully to express what he wanted to express, it's simply because he did not know clearly and rationally what it was that he wanted to express. It means that he knew it only as a generalized package deal. If he knew it clearly, that which you know clearly, you will find the words for and you will express exactly.
Do you have objections here literally?
No, I mean by psychological implication. That's a good question. Thank you for correcting me. I mean poor introspector. I mean, in fact, a man who, whichever his conviction, was not in full control of his understanding of the process of writing and of the objective method by which his subconscious would feed him that which he wanted. It would be a man who would have his theme defined approximately, but not sufficiently supported with full understanding of all the elements of that theme. And Sinclair Lewis, incidentally, if you look at his writing, you would see that that's exactly what would happen to him. Because it's a very intelligent man, particularly in his early novels, the ideas and themes that he wants to express are clear. The manner in which he expresses them is not always, particularly in the realm of emotions. It's a man who can express ideas and characterization up to a certain point. When it comes to emotions or deeper values, he's an unhappy repressor. And I'm now saying only on the basis of his writing. I don't know him, or I've met him just once. This we will take up a little later in more detail, the role of repression and the disastrous effect it has on a writer. But here I want you to understand only, first of all, the general relationship of your inspiration, so-called, to your conscious purposes. I'd like to pause here for a moment just to ask you, is it all clear so far?
Totally perfect, yeah.
Clear? Now then, when you will hear me denouncing those who speak about their feelings in art, I want you to understand that I'm speaking of those who intend to be run by their feelings, refuse to identify what those feelings are, and hold those feelings as first causes, rather as what they in fact are, namely effects. Your feelings are necessary for you to write, but you have to know their causes, and in that way control the kind of feelings, the kind of inspiration, the kind of spontaneous ideas that you will have to rely on when you write. That process, however, is not being run by your feelings. That process, the process which I describe and advocate, is knowing how to use your feelings. There, in relation to writing, it's exactly the same relationship as in the relationship of your ideas or premises to your feelings in a properly rational man. The rational man is not a repressor. He's not a man who does not feel only. He is a man who knows the nature of his feelings, knows the premises from which they come, is ruled by his mind, and his emotions follow from his mind without any contradictions or any blocks or obstructions. It's a healthy, rational man is a man who has no conflict between his emotions and his mind. His mind makes his choice of values and his emotions follow. Same thing applies to a rational writer. It's not a writer who does not use his feelings or does not feel and never uses inspiration but calculates everything consciously. No, it would be impossible, and one doesn't have to do that. A rational writer is one who knows what he wants to express, knows how his mind works, and then is able to give the right order to his subconscious so that it feeds him the right inspiration, the right ideas, the right choices. I could say that I have written many scenes which I had not planned in advance, beyond a very loose general definition that this scene will accomplish such and such purpose. And when I come to it, the scene writes itself. Unfortunately, I can't claim to have done it often because that is the happiest state that a writer can reach and the most wonderful experience. You come to a scene and you feel as if it is somebody else dictating it. You suddenly know, without any critical judgment, what the scene has to be. You begin to write as if you're listening to the characters. You think of nothing, a paragraph ahead, you don't know what's coming. It's surprising you as it comes. You write almost in a blind trance. And afterwards, when you reread it, it's almost perfect. You might need to change a word here or there, or clarify something, but the essence of the scene is there. And most of my best passages are written that way. But what is the meaning of it? That is the accident that happens only to those who deserve it. Those scenes are usually the scenes on which I was so clear, all the elements, whether intellectual, emotional, artistic, or everything that went into it, were so familiar to me that once I had set the general purpose, that's all that I needed to do. My subconscious did the rest. But it did it because those ideas were so clear to me that the words, the examples, everything needed came as if by itself. On other scenes, which might be composed of elements with which I'm not so familiar, I would have to work and rework paragraph by paragraph and rewrite the scene 10 times. I hope that in the net result you won't be able to tell which is which. I doubt whether you could. It'll be interesting to me if you care to ask me sometime afterwards. I can tell you right now which is which, because I remember the process by which they were written. But on the basis of those inspirational scenes, I, being a good introspector, would never claim that what a writer has to do is just sit and wait until that kind of inspirational streak hits him, because I know better than anybody that will never come. What then do the inspirational writers do? Because as you know, there are writers who never plan their scenes and who will tell you the exact opposite of what I'm saying. That writing is an art which can't be taught, that it's an innate talent, you either have it or you don't. And if you sit down to write, well, either God moves you or he doesn't. And if it doesn't, there's nothing you can do about it. Now, those writers are not necessarily lying in the conscious sense of the word. They're merely poor introspectors. They do not know what it is that makes them write. Usually, that type of writer runs for a few years and writes himself out. You have heard of the phenomenal writers who write themselves out. As a rule, they start writing rather young. They show what is called unusual promise or something brilliantly original, and in a few years you see them repeating the same thing over and over again, and it's less brilliant and less original each time, and it gets staler and staler, and pretty soon the writer finds he has nothing to write about. That inspiration, which he didn't know the source of, has vanished. He doesn't know how to replenish it. In fact, what he did is he was using, without clearly defined system, he caught on, in effect, by imitation more than by understanding, to the process of writing. That is, he grasped that people can put ideas and feelings and impressions down on paper, and he did it. If he had enough original observation stored in his subconscious, his writing might have had some values for a while. I personally would never find any value in any writer of that kind. But if you want to analyze their work objectively, you might see that certain kind of literary values are present among an awful lot of irrelevant and meaningless junk. But you could say there is someone who has a certain literary color, meaning certain things he does well. And in a few years, that literary color has vanished. Well, as I was saying, he merely got the generalized idea of what writing is, and he coasted on his subconscious for a while, never attempting to analyze what was that process, where did his ideas come from, what he was doing and why. In fact, such a writer is very antagonistic to any analysis. That will be the type who will tell you something like the cold hand of reason will be detrimental to his inspiration. He doesn't want any reason as part of his work. He cannot function by means of reason, and he's afraid that if he begins to analyze, it'll stop his inspiration altogether. And if this is the way he functions, it would stop him. Because what he's doing is coasting automatically on that which he knows already. When he has used that store of early impressions, he has nothing more to say. Now, a rational writer can stoke his subconscious in exactly the same way as you would put fuel in a machine. If you know where your inspiration really comes from, you will never run out of material. In fact, the more you write, the more opportunities you see for it. The more ideas occur to you, and the greater your scope. If you keep on storing things in your mind for future writing and integrating your choice of theme to your general conviction, to your general knowledge, and allow your writing to grow wider and wider as your knowledge widens, then you will know how to always have something to say, and you find better and better ways to say it. You will not go stale, and you will not coast downhill after one original outbreak of something valuable. But if you are part on one premise, part on the other, if you're part convinced by what I'm saying, and part of your mind is still thinking, yeah, but how do I know that it isn't an innate talent? How do I know whether it will work for me or not? Chances are that either you won't start writing at all, or you'll start according to which conviction is stronger in you, but you will condemn yourself to perpetual terror. Because each time you write something well, you will be in danger of this question: will I do it next time? I don't know why I did it well this time. How do I know what I'll do next? That, incidentally, is a complaint which I've heard from many well-established famous writers. Incidentally, is a complaint which I've heard from many well-established famous writers, that they have little anxiety attacks before starting a book, because no matter how successful they are, since they do not fully know and do not want to know what the process of writing consists of, and incidentally a side issue, and why a book is or is not successful. They have no ideas about that either, since they have no clear idea about communication, neither about how you communicate nor how readers perceive that which you offer. They will always be at the mercy of this terror. Yes, 10 novels were good. How do I know my 11th one will be good? And usually those writers, with the years, instead of improving, either maintain a very precarious level, but more likely begin to be less and less good with the years, rather than improving. I think Somerset Maugham would be a good example of it. Now, here is a man who, as far as I can gather his views from his writing, does not believe that writing is a rational process. He does believe that it's accidental and inspirational one. And you notice that his later works are much less interesting, less good than his early ones. So he doesn't quite write himself out. The quality deteriorates. Now then, the purpose of my particular lectures will be to tell you what kind of premises you need specifically for the art of fiction writer. First in a general way, and then we'll work on each aspect of writing in greater details. But from what I've said so far, you can see already to what extent my particular aesthetics, that is the philosophy of writing, depends on my general philosophy. Shall we make a 10-minute break at this point?
Yeah.
Now, I will assume that the points I made so far are clear, so I won't go into greater detail about the psychological aspects, because we will be discussing them at each particular point of the different aspects of a novel when we come to it. Here I only wanted to indicate to you in a general way the relationship between premises and performance in writing, and the general explanation of how and why writing is a matter of premises like everything else in a man, and not a matter of an innate talent. Therefore, paraphrasing Cecil in that opening story I gave you, I agree with him in one respect. Anybody can invent a story, anybody can be a writer if he is willing to do the thinking required for it. But without that thinking, nobody can be a writer, and those who succeed carry the seeds of their own destruction in their own talent, precisely to the extent to which that talent is unconscious, unidentified, not based on firm philosophical premises. At this point, I will go into what is art, and then specifically what is literary art. Later, in subsequent lecture, when we will devote several sessions each to each particular aspect of writing, it's then that in identifying every aspect and the rules and premises that control it, it's then that we will discuss the psychological methods and the way to prepare your subconscious in greater detail, in specific detail. Now then, let's ask the general question of what is art. Now, my definition of art is as follows. Art is a recreation of reality according to one's values. And this will need a little elaboration for those of you who have not heard it before, because it's a very generalized statement. Why do I say that it's a recreation of reality? By recreation, I don't mean copying, but neither do I mean creation in a mystical sense. I do not mean going contrary to reality or indulging in fantasy. I mean creating that which could be real and ought to be real, paraphrasing Aristotle. You know the Aristotelian quotation in that respect. When he says that could be, he does mean that which is consistent with reality as opposed to fantasy. I will mention here in parentheses that conscious and deliberate fantasy is a legitimate method or part of art, but again, one has to know how to use it within a rational framework. We discussed it briefly in one of our sessions, and we'll come to it later. But then there, fantasy is used not in the metaphysical sense, but in a purely literary, inventive sense, and proper fantasy, again, has to be consonant with metaphysically proper reality. Therefore, when I say a writer recreates reality, I don't mean that he creates a mystical fourth dimension or something totally incompatible with actual fact. This applies to writing things as they could be. Now, things as they ought to be implies the value realm. Now, it is inconceivable, in fact, to have an art divorced from values, whether any particular artist claims anything contrary to it or not. What any particular artist cares to identify is his business. But regardless of what he says, any judge of literature or any other writer has to judge for himself whether any writer's claim is in fact supported by by that writer's performance. For instance, The so-called naturalistic school of writing will tell you that they don't believe that values exist, and therefore they do not include values in their art. What they overlook when they claim it is that values cannot be separated from any human activity. In this sense, anything that a man does is a matter of choice. Any human action, not only art, but even simple production of material goods, is necessarily a matter of choice. A man can do it or not. It's up to him to decide whether he'll do it and then how he'll do it. Now, art is only one human activity. It is impossible for a man to decide to do a work of art or to write a book without some kind of selectivity directing his actions. A man writing a book will necessarily have to decide what he includes in it and what he doesn't, what he presents and how he presents it. Every time that a man has to exercise a choice, he is directed by some kind of values, conscious or not, acknowledged by him or not. He cannot escape from the fact that he has to make a choice. Again, the only question open to him is what choice he'll make and what he will be guided by in making that choice. Now, when you attempt to recreate reality, whether it's a painting, a statue, or a novel, you necessarily have decided what aspects of reality you're going to deal with. That is a choice. And directing your choice will be your general philosophical code of values. Applied to art as applied to your personal life. You have no choice about escaping philosophy, because all men have it. The choice is, do you know your own philosophy? Do you select it consciously, or are you at the mercy of your subconscious, of chance generalizations, and undigested abstractions accepted on faith from others without any clear understanding and clear decision on your part? You can do one or the other, but you cannot escape the responsibility of a choice. Now, you all know, in sort of pragmatic, unidentified way, that photography and painting are not the same kind of activity. Photography is not considered an art, although there are artistic photographs. Photography as such, as a method, is not an art, but painting is. And as applied to writing, journalism is not literature. Now ask yourself why. The distinction is very simple. Photography is a mechanical means of reproducing whichever is put in front of the camera. When you speak of an artistic photograph, what you mean is that the photographer exercised choice in his arrangement of the material which his camera is to reproduce. You call the photograph artistic because of the choice of angle, the arrangement of material or of light and shadow, to emphasize something, to stress something, to present a particular aspect. That is art. But the mere process of photographing, the mechanical part of it, is not art because no choice is involved. The camera operates the same way regardless of the nature of the material. But why is a painting a work of art? Because everything about it is selected. Not only the subject and the way in which it's going to be executed, but the process of execution is a process of constant choice. That is why it is an art, as far as the method is concerned now, not the content. Same applies to writing. You have to use words both for a newspaper story or for a fiction story. But what is the difference? You can write a newspaper story artistically, meaning that you can exercise choice in your presentation, in a flat or colorful way in which you present the story, what kind of words you use to present it. Your manner can be very artistic, but the assignment of a journalist is to report as objectively and accurately as possible on a certain event or series of events. The purpose of a fiction writer is to create the events. Here again, as in the case of a painter, everything has to be selected. Not only is the method by which he presents is selected, but the material with which he deals is selected. Therefore, a journalist can exercise his sense of values only on his method, on the how of presenting a story. A journalist who chooses the material of the story and fakes it will be a very poor journalist, a slanted journalist, the kind you get too much of today. A proper journalist, his basic premise as far as his material is concerned, to report exactly what happened. And the judgment he has to exercise is to report the essentials, to know what is essential to the story which he's presenting. But now the purpose of a fiction writer and his range of subjectivity includes the events themselves. A journalist, if you asked him, why did you write this story, would have a perfect and proper answer if he tells you, because it happened. A writer does not have that excuse. A writer has to know why he selects this particular story and what is it that he wants to say by means of that story. Now ask yourself, why has art existed in human history? Why do men like art? Why do people write books or read them? It certainly is not to learn about events, because for that purpose you have journalists. It's not to learn something about life, because for that purpose you have non-fiction stories. You have history or you have philosophy. What is it that a novel does, or work of fiction, which a work of non-fiction cannot do? So here I refer you to my definition. It presents reality according to a certain code of values. Any other human activity is utilitarian in the sense that whichever product you're engaged in making, the product itself is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. If you make an automobile, it's for the purpose of driving. If you write a journalistic account of an event, it's for the purpose of information, of letting people know about this event. When you make a work of art, the purpose there is the work of art itself. The distinction between a utilitarian object or an art object is precisely this, that an art object is an end in itself. Now, questions are very often asked about such things as, what if you take a statue, which is a work of art, and attach an electrical bulb and a lampshade on top of it, and you have a lamp. Is it a work of art or not? Well, it's both. You could say that the object as a whole is now not a work of art because it serves a utilitarian purpose. Its purpose is to give light. But that part of that object was at one time or is executed for the lampstand as a work of art. That is, it represents certain kind of aspect of reality, whether it's a human figure or whichever it might be, according to the artist's values. Now, when we come to literature, let's ask ourselves, what is the purpose of a literary work? Well, if it's a recreation of reality according to one's values, then the first thing you would have to know is that it will have to be a story about human beings. Why? Because although a human being can hold values about inanimate matter or about animals, that would hardly be the subject of a literary composition. You might have an essay on nature, you might have a very beautiful description of nature, but your views and values on nature will not form a story. When you speak of values, your primary and most important values will be those affecting yourself and therefore other human beings. It will be your view of men that is involved when you deal with a literary composition. I won't in this point go into details about how the same idea applies to other forms of art. It does apply to all forms, but the connection there will not be as direct. It's, for instance, more obvious in sculptures than in painting. I will mention only that even in painting landscapes without figures, what an artist is really representing is his human values. It will be his human perspective on nature. But that in detail is a more complex subject and a sideline, which we won't take in detail here. I see Ms. Rukavina, who is an art expert, nodding. You would agree with that? This is only for purposes of clarification, because we're concerned mainly with literature. Now, there's one point that I want to make here, and that is about the question of an end in itself. In fact, nothing that a man does is an end in itself, as apart from man, because nothing in it is an end in itself except a man and a man's life. Because if you take the definition, an end in itself, in a literal metaphysical sense, there will be a contradiction involved, because it would mean that a work of art is a value regardless of men, regardless of the author or the audience. That would be an exaggeration. And when I said an end in itself, I meant only as distinguished from utilitarian objects that a man can make. Therefore, the next question is, what is the purpose of art? It can't be an end in itself in the sense of, I write a book because I feel like writing it, or I paint a painting because I feel like it. There is some reason why I feel like doing it. There is a reason why men want to look at the painting or read the book. The purpose in all art is the objectivization of values. The fundamental, most general motive that makes a writer want to write, again, whether he knows it consciously or not, but simply by the implication of the activity which he has chosen, the purpose is to objectify his values, meaning his view of life and that which is important in life. The reason men want to read a book is for the same purpose. In order to see values, to see a presentation of reality from the aspect of or slanted to human values, with which a reader then may agree or disagree, and his liking or disliking of a work of art will have a great deal to do with his basic attitude on human values. But the reason why in reading a story or looking at a painting we feel that it's an end in itself, that we don't want to use that experience for any other purpose. It's a pleasure by itself. The nature of that pleasure is precisely the fact that we are observing a realization of values. We're seeing the concrete application of human values. If we learn something from a novel, if you take a novelist like myself, who would be called a philosophical novelist, meaning that I always have abstract philosophical themes in the things I write, that in effect is a side issue from this aspect. Whether a novel has a philosophical message or not is a less basic issue. It's an issue of detail, which we'll discuss later. But taking art at its base, that is, taking art as in its fundamental definition, what is important is not the philosophical message which an author projects explicitly, but the values, the view of life, which an author projects implicitly. I could write, and very much want to write, a detective story or a plain action thriller which will have no message, no long speeches, nothing ostensibly philosophical about it. And yet, that kind of story will carry all of my philosophy, and it will carry it implicitly. It's in this sense that whether a novel has a conscious philosophical message or not, the mere fact of what you select to present and how you present it will express your fundamental values. When I say fundamental, I mean metaphysical. I mean your view of the nature of reality, of man's relationship to it, and of that which man should or can seek in life. Now, the four attributes of a novel. When I say attributes, I mean parts which cannot be extricated, parts which, that which composes a novel. The four attributes are theme, plot, characterization, style. I will here define them very briefly, and then, after these introductory remarks, in subsequent lecture, we will take each one of these in great detail. Here, I will mention them and define them only for purposes of general identification. Now, you know what the theme of a novel is. I will define it briefly as the general abstraction of which the events of the novel serve as the illustration or the concrete. In simple colloquial language, the theme is the message of a novel, that which the novel as a whole adds up to, that which will summarize its meaning in one or two sentences. Now, here, particularly for the attention of the junior collective, oh God, the mentionable word, well, you know what I mean. I'm making this aside because I know this is a problem that you will all have. Too much philosophical consciousness. For your benefit, but everybody else's too. I want to stress very specifically that the theme of a novel does not have to be philosophical and is not the same thing as the philosophical message. For instance, as we mentioned, Gone with the Wind. Now that's a very good novel. It's actually a work of very high art. It has no philosophical theme, but what is its theme? The destruction of the Southern way of life, which vanished with the wind. In other words, the results of the Civil War, its impact on the South. That is a historical theme. The philosophy of the writer is implicit in the book. And if you analyze the novel, you would be able to tell a great many things by the nature of the events, the nature of the presentation, and the style. You'll be able to tell what the author's philosophy is. But the author does not have to have a conscious philosophical message in order to write a good novel. The novel does not have to have a theme in the philosophical sense of a message, but it does have to have some kind of generalized concept which serves as the scene. In this case, the destruction of the South. Let's take a novel like Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt. Now, that also is a novel without a philosophical theme, but what would you name as a theme? The characterization of a certain type of man, an American average small businessman. The presentation of that kind of character. That is a sufficient abstraction on which to build a novel, a very intelligent novel. Whether a novel has a wider philosophical message or not is a separate consideration, which you would have to consider when you weigh novels, when you estimate them. You will have to estimate each attribute separately. And a novel that would have a very wide theme would, if well presented, other things being equal, will be a better work of art than a novel with a narrower theme. But in no particular department of a novel, except one, could you say that if that aspect is good, then all others are to be ignored? Namely, if a novel presents a marvelous philosophical message, individualism, rationality, and everything we believe in, but has no plot, miserable characterization in a wooden style full of bromides, then it's a very bad work of art, regardless of your sympathy for the message or not. On the other hand, a novel like Quo Vadis, which I consider technically probably the best novel ever written, technically, from the aspect of construction, has a message with which I would not agree at all, namely the glorification of Christianity and the rise of Christian culture and the destruction of the Roman one. Now, I don't sympathize with the message. That is a separate consideration. The nature of the theme is not the only standard of judging a novel. What, from the literary viewpoint, all you would have to know is what was the author's theme and how did he carry it out in judging purely literary aesthetic value. Whether you agree with the novel or not is a separate question. Now, the element which I personally would say is the most important in a novel, that is the one which, if it is good, I would consider everything else secondary. That element is plot. What is a plot? Well, my definition of plot is a purposeful progression of events. That is a very brief definition which needs specifying and detailing. When I say purposeful, I mean that all the events of a story have to be logically connected. One has to be the outgrowth of the preceding one, and all of them add up to a final climax. I'll state it here briefly because we have discussed all this in greater detail. But this is just for purposes of review and for the new members to have at least some general idea of what we mean by plot. I make particular stress on the word event, because you can have a purposeful progression of ideas or of conversations, but not of action. If a novel does not deal with action, whichever it might be, it will not be a good novel. Because if you do not present the events with which you're concerned in terms of physical action, you are departing from the basic definition of a novel, which is a story about events. If you devote long pages to introspection or stream of consciousness, all the modern kinds of devices, whichever it is you're writing, it is not a novel. Because a novel is a story of human beings in action. Introspection or their mental processes and their emotions are part of action. But until you have dramatized your story in the form of an action, you have not given it reality. A plotless novel contradicts the basic purpose of art, namely the objectivization of values. To be objective, something has to be expressed in physical reality. That which goes on in your mind cannot be objectively communicated to anyone except by means of physical action, if only speech. There is no communication except by physical means. Now, a writer does have the privilege of going into the mind of a character and projecting that which no one but the character, in fact, can know. That's one of the advantages of a writer. But if that is all he does, if a writer does nothing but project the thought process of a character, he has not really objectivized his story. It might be a very interesting psychological treatise. It is not a work of art. Because to be a work of art, it has to be presented in terms of reality. To be presented in terms of reality, it has to be presented in terms of action, because that is the only way in which values exist or are perceivable in reality. The next attribute is characterization. Now that doesn't take particular definition, but beyond saying that it's the presentation of human characters, meaning the nature of the people involved in your story. The fourth attribute, style, is a very wide category. I include under it two main subdivisions, namely the selection of the particulars which you use in your story and the selection of words, the structure of your sentences. The kind of events you select comes under the category of plot and of your plot structure. But assuming the same plot line, several writers would treat it entirely differently. Let us suppose, just as an illustration, that you have to describe this room. Now, one writer might give a minute catalog indiscriminately of everything that he sees in this room. Another writer might select only the essentials, select that which gives this room its character, and know which aspects are the essentials and which to name. A third writer might decide not to catalog, but he won't know how to select the essentials. And he will say something inconclusive and inappropriate, such as, let's say, it was a narrow room with pale walls and some chairs. Now, it's a description, but it's not a very good one. That is what I mean by particulars. What elements within each development of your story do you choose to include for each particular purpose, whether it's the description of a room, of a character, and if it's events, what part of the events you tell, how much, do you present the essentials, or a meaningless catalog, or an incomplete indication? In other words, what aspects of any given assignment do you choose to communicate? That will be your choice of particulars, and that I classify under style. When we come to the detailed discussion of style, as I promised you, I want to select passages from different writers treating the same theme, such as a description of New York or a love scene, or whichever element one can find in many writers. And by reading what they've done with the same kind of assignment, you will see what the matter of choosing particulars actually is, and in what manner it will always betray the basic philosophy of the writer, because a choice is involved here. And again, whether his philosophy is conscious or not, that is where you will be able to spot it. Now, style proper, that which is commonly understood by style, is your choice of words, the way you construct your sentences. The clarity or confusion, the precision or vagueness, the underwriting or overwriting of your statement, that constitutes style proper. And that, as I warned you before, is something which you must never attempt to achieve consciously. Just never start writing by aiming to create a style for yourself. Of all the elements of writing, style is the most complex and the one that you should leave to instinct. There is no such thing as instinct. But I mean it here in the sense in which I explained earlier of what functions of your mind you learn sufficiently well to let them become automatic so that they will feel to you as if they were an instinct, meaning that you know it so well that you're doing it automatically. You don't have to give it any conscious attention or study. The elements of style, or that which leads to a style, we will study in great detail. And as you'll see, it is so complex, so many choices are open to you in your use of words, or in the way you construct and present sentences, that is impossible for you to decide in advance, that is at the start of your writing career, I will have style number so-and-so. Detailed but not over-detailed, tender but not violent, or whichever nonsense you might have heard in literary schools. There is no way to decide that in advance. A style comes in effect from the sum of all of your literary premises, and the sum of your literary premises will come from your philosophical premises. The only way to acquire a distinctive style is by practice. On your first attempts, the elements of your future style, if you have any literary premises set already, will be apparent. But it will be impossible for anyone to have a definite, recognizable style of his own, the kind of style that if you saw a paragraph, you could tell it was written by so-and-so. It is impossible to have that ahead of practicing writing, because it is too complex an issue and has to become automatic before it is thoroughly individual and polished and recognizable. Now, so much for the general elements of a novel, or rather the attributes, which will, as I said, we'll take in detail later.